Hey there, Business for Unicorns podcast listeners. This is Mark, and I'm here to tell you about an awesome free resource on businessforunicorns.com. If you ever find yourself feeling frustrated with your training gym because you know that there are all sorts of things you could work on, but you're not really sure how to prioritize, you don't know what's the most important thing to work on or what order you should be tackling your priorities, well, now is the time to go to businessforunicorns.com, click the button, and fill out our free self-assessment. With the Ultimate Training Gym Owner Report Card, you will gain immediate clarity on just where to be focusing your attention to create more positive impact on your community, to drive more revenue and take home income, and to do it all with less stress and more peace of mind. So go to businessofunicorns.com, click the button, fill out that free self-assessment, and start building a business and life you love today.
Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. And today we're going a little old school because it's just me and Mark. What's up, Fisher?
Like the old days.
Like the old
Nothing
days.
much.
Before Pete was our friend and joined us on the podcast. Well, I guess we were technically friends. We weren't podcast friends yet.
That's true.
Yeah, I'm excited to keep it intimate today. And today it's really going to be me interviewing you about a recent kind of personal and professional decision you made. So without spilling too many of the beans, I'm going to let you talk about it. Dear listeners, Mark recently decided to invest in a franchise, a fitness franchise. So what I wanted to do is kind of talk to him about today about how he made that decision, what factors he considered when deciding what franchise to invest in, what he hopes to learn from it, and hopefully, what you, dear listeners, can learn from Mark's experience so far. So let's just dive in with Fisher. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what did you decide to do?
Yeah, well, I decided to invest in a franchise, which is, I think I have to assume, maybe surprising to a lot of people. A lot of people might assume I'm somebody that doesn't like to color inside the sandbox. Certainly, we have cultivated somewhat intentionally over the years an image of Mark Fisher Fitness and me as what one might call crazy. And that's not incorrect, and certainly have a lot of personal eccentricities. But in fact, I consider myself as much of an operator as the quote unquote visionary for the business. So what wound up happening was maybe about 2 years ago, I started looking deeply into franchises just as a model. First of all, somebody that's interested in business, I just found it interesting because by definition, these are the most scalable businesses you can create because essentially you are offering someone a done-for-you business in a box, so to speak, right?
Yeah, they're designed to be copy and pasteable.
Yeah. So if anyone's read E-Myth, which if you haven't, what are you waiting for? That the example they use is that in a perfect world, all businesses would be franchisable. Not necessarily that you want to franchise them literally, but in the sense there's very clear SOPs for every thing that happens in the business. And the advantage of this is, at least in theory, it's easier because you have to think less and make less of the decisions. Now, let's be upfront. There's some downsides to this. I don't think this is the right model for a lot of people because unless you're willing to play in a sandbox, you can get into some issues. So one of the things that has been interesting as I've been studying the world of franchisees and franchisors, the very common issue you'll see in a lot of these models, that sort of cliche is, every franchisee is like, oh, the franchisor doesn't understand me. I'm here working so hard and I'm in shackles and I have all these great ideas and I can't even do them. And then every franchisor broadly, and I'm speaking general, there's some that have great relations, but broadly, the franchisors often feel like, oh my gosh, the franchisees don't understand how hard it is. We're spending all this money on the marketing and we're working so hard to really test and vet out these marketing strategies and these new revenue streams, and the franchisees aren't necessarily appreciative of it. Now, again, that's speaking broadly. There are many relationships that are pretty functional, but that's often one of the tensions that can occur in this model because it's a very unique relationship. Because as a franchisee, you're not an employee, but you're not quite a client. So you're something of a partner, but there's definitely a power hierarchy because by dint of this legal document you've signed, you are not able to go rogue. Right? Because in theory, that's the value of signing up for a franchise is that you won't go rogue. You're doing proven done for you systems. So I'm the first to admit this is not the right call for everybody. But for me, I was very open to that. And admittedly, part of the equation was having somebody in my network that was able to be an operator. And I thought it was a better investment than some of the other things I was doing to speak to the financial part of the equation.
That makes sense. Well, let's just start really kind of tactically. And because I know that you worked with, I think it's called a broker to kind of vet all your franchising options. So can you just talk a little bit about just tactically about like the step-by-step process one might go through if they were to consider investing in a franchise of any kind, really. So can you just talk about that process? Yeah.
Sure. So I did probably, 6 to 9 months worth of research of just listening to podcasts, being in Facebook groups, reading books, to just kind of get the lay of the land of what that world was like. Because franchising, people that are in the space will be quick to acknowledge it's not an industry, it's a model, right? So it's lots of industries, but it's a particular model of doing business. And like every model, there are some pros and cons to it, right? So that really allowed me to see kind of the lay of the land. I had noticed that there were a number of people in the fitness industry that, in addition to running their own businesses, had either later gone on to have very large multi-unit franchise groups, or in some cases continue to run them both concurrently. So this was something that just became interesting to me. And a lot of it, frankly, was just like, I want to learn. There's things about this model I figured would make me more effective at everything I'm doing in my career as a professional, as a business person. And in my situation, I ultimately wound up hiring, as you mentioned, someone called a franchise broker. So a broker is someone you can work with, and there's my understanding is a pretty large number of people that do this professionally. And these individuals essentially are paid by franchisors to line them up with good franchisees. So essentially they function something like a matchmaker. So the thing to note here is the franchisee doesn't pay anything. It's the franchisor that pays the broker. So the reality is you don't really lose a lot if you're considering doing a franchise by working with a broker, because ultimately you're not out of any money. The only real downside is, by definition, franchise brokers don't have every franchise in their back pocket. In a perfect world, part of the value they bring is they have vetted the ones, so the ones they do are likely to be more viable, because not every franchise business is a good business, right? Just like not every independent business is a good business. And a good broker will likely take you through some set of their proprietary set of exercises, a series of questions, of visioning exercise to get clear on why are you doing this, what is you're looking to get out of this, and how does this fit with the rest of your life. We worked with somebody that was really remarkable, a gentleman named Rick Bizio, who was just fantastic. And again, for me, somebody broadly committed to learning. It was some of the best coaching I've received in my life to date, because as it happened, we sort of lucked into this individual who, my understanding by all accounts, is kind of a big deal in the field. And it is true, somebody with, his decades of experience had a real mastery and a simplicity for how he distilled this process that was very, very interesting. And then through him, it allowed us to compare side by side a number of different franchise models to consider.
Yeah. Well, through that process with your broker, and you mentioned this a few times now, one of the reasons for doing this is because you wanted to learn some things, right? You were hoping this would continue your kind of professional and career development. Can you just say a little bit about what you're hoping to learn from this experience?
Yes, I think there were a number of, I wouldn't say holes, but there are a number of places in my approach to business where I felt I continually was getting stuck. And it was my hope that by learning how franchises work, they could help me. Now, to be very clear, it's a very serious thing when you go into a franchise, like you do not steal the IP, right? So to be clear, that is a thing that is a very important, I'm a very loyal person. So I very much want to respect that. And studying franchises in general, I believe, is helping me unpack my tendency to often overly complicate things, right? I tend to, in ways that are understandable, and I think oftentimes really work for me in a lot of situations, to always treat every single person as an individual, to not be particularly hard-ass all the time about exceptions and policies, to wanting to have zillions of different membership options. So I've noticed, having lived with myself a lot, I have a tendency in ways that are not helpful to overly complicate a lot of things. And a franchise as a model, it's literally the point. It is the opposite of that. So I think part of it was getting an experiential understanding of what it's like when I am forced to get out of my own way, because I can't think of complicated things that are going to bog down the efficiencies of the operation and make my life less fun and sometimes less profitable than otherwise could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's honestly, it's a realization about yourself that we've seen a lot of our Unicorn Society clients have, which is they have a tendency to run their businesses in a way that gets overly complex, where they treat every client like an individual snowflake, and everyone can have their own rates and their own policies, and every employee gets to behave in their own way with their own approach to scheduling and pay. And so it's very easy when running small businesses like often training gyms are, to not have very clear, very firm policies and procedures and treating everyone like a snowflake. And so it makes perfect sense to me that one of the things you would learn from a franchise is how to not do that as much, right? How to dial things in and run a business as if you were going to franchise, even if you never will. So that's super clear. Anything else you were hoping to learn from this?
Honestly, I think that was the biggest piece. And certainly, I'm sure I'll uncover things that I don't know. And certainly, I think I'll be able to tell you more in 1 to 2 years. No doubt things I learned the hard way, because I can't foresee, I don't yet know what I don't know that I'm going to learn by going through this process. But I think the simplicity piece for me so far is the biggest takeaway. And I think I had some sense of that, but to be able to really look at, gosh, this P&L has like not a lot of things on it. There's not that many lines of expenses. There's not that many lines of, income. Yeah. And again, it's not to say necessarily that I'm going to go back in and rip off all the Band-Aids at a place like MFF that we're only selling one thing and half of you are fired. By no means am I doing that. I love MFF for what it is. But I think the takeaway for me, and I think for a lot of our listeners, is as the independent owner, that often is the thing. It's the complexity that kills scale. And it is very difficult, I think, to have the intestinal fortitude, because often what you're having to do is consistently make difficult decisions to make your business simple. And I think there's an art here, because depending on what you want, I don't know that needs to be the only barometer. So frankly, is Mark Fisher Fitness franchisable and scalable? Well, no, not in its current form. And I'm not sure, we've talked about this. I don't know that we're willing to do the kinds of things we would need to do to this beautiful love letter of a business that, might I add, is also a really banging business that we love, that is very effective, that helps a lot of people. It's a very profitable business. It does remarkably high revenues for the type of business it is. So it certainly doesn't feel necessarily like it's a burning house there. But my hope is that, I will be a little bit more thoughtful about making things simpler and having a little bit more, I think, self-restraint when I find myself starting to go into this overly complicated place is not actually helpful, right? But I do want to make sure that's a massage on the other side to caution listeners that, to some extent, if you have an independent gym, it's part of the benefit is you're allowed to be creative and make those kinds of decisions. And in my experience, usually the issue is not that the training gym owner has made their business so simple that they have too little memberships, they don't have enough revenue streams, they've made their payout too simple, so therefore the coaches are storming off. Is that possible? In theory, you could go too far with this, but certainly in and I suspect yours as well, that hasn't been what I've seen working with actual humans. It's usually the opposite.
Yeah, 100%. I have a hard time imagining that in running a business like a training gym, that you can oversimplify the processes and procedures and systems that run the gym. Simple is just really almost always better. So let me ask you this though, because you mentioned a few minutes ago that you chose franchising because it was a better investment of your time and energy and money than other things you could have invested in. Yeah. So, I don't have to go into a ton of detail about all the things you were considering, but just for our listeners' benefit, how did you think about making that decision? What made franchising the best use of your time, energy, and money?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say out loud is it remains to be seen if, in fact, I've made the right decision. But essentially,
we'll do a podcast later. We'll do a follow-up.
Yeah, we'll find out.
To let you know.
I'll be nothing if not candid, dear listeners. I essentially had been So, and we've discussed this before, I think, on previous podcasts, but so I am a very boring investor by definition. I'm rather conservative. So I tend to, most of my investing is like boring index funds, boring portfolio investing, which if anybody's read basic finance stuff, you'll know what I'm referring to. If not, please go read basic finance stuff. And after a certain amount of time, I want to get some diversification to other things. So I've done a fair bit of real estate investing where I go in as a limited partner. Now, the advantages of those opportunities are I'm getting some diversification. And the biggest advantage of this, and this is a meaningful thing I'll kind of circle back to here at the current opportunity, is there's no work involved. It's truly passive. So there's no opportunity cost, because this is both an opportunity and a threat. Like all of your life, my entrepreneur friends, is if you start moving too much of your energy away from your core business, you can often starve the golden goose because you're messing around because, you know, and I'm not saying you can't do this. People have done this very successfully, but you stop focusing on your business because you're trying to open up Airbnbs, or you're decide you want to open up a coffee shop or whatever it is, right? And in my case, the advantage of those types of limited partnership, or essentially I would essentially give somebody a check to a management company, was I was getting, at least in theory, a comparable or generally a better potential return than more traditional index bonds. Because real estate is an asset class, unlike, you know, maybe giving a friend startup money, right? Unlike my friend's startups, there's no chance that the real estate is going to go down to zero. So to some extent, I think you have a little bit of a hedge against potential downsides. Your worst outcome there usually is like, oh, the return wasn't quite what I wanted. Or, you know, the luck of timing, I could have done better because the S&P had a real upswing that I missed over, you know, let's say the 7-year period that those funds were being used both to invest in the property, you know, have, let's say, a 7-year period after a year or two of getting some quarterly distributions. And then the way those plays usually work is the building is sold, and that's where a lot of the upside happens. Then you get a windfall at the end of this specific period of time where the investment group that's running it is doing it to get the best possible return for themselves and their investors. Now, the downside of that type of investing, even though I love the simplicity of it, is your upside is often capped or at least mitigated because by definition, the people running the business are getting a piece of everything. Now, you still all in, like if it's a good deal, will come out better than you would on average in the stock market, but you're not going to get exponential upside just by definition of the asset class and because you're sharing it. Now, franchises, really when it came down to it, as I started doing numbers in a spreadsheet and just looking at like my year over year potential cash on cash and internal rate of return, and it occurred to me that, you know, I was going to get a meaningfully better return if I was running the business. Number two, because the way compounding interest works, an extra few points over a 10, 15, 20-year horizon will really add up to a meaningfully different amount of money in a way that's hard for the brain to understand because humans struggle to understand the exponential function. And my bet was, okay, this is going to be a little bit more work for sure, but it allows me to leverage my existing skill set. So I bet I can have more control over my destiny, because the other potential downside of the real estate is I don't know enough to, and I wouldn't want to. It would be inappropriate of me to be looking over the shoulder of the management company. Whereas if I'm the owner in the business, it's not only appropriate, it's welcome, particularly when I'm leveraging my existing skill sets. That is been how I've made my living for my career. And in this particular case, as I mentioned, I have an owner operator who's been a long-term client of ours at Business Unicorns. And because Greg is in a place in his life where it made sense for him, where he wanted to have the opportunity to be the operator, it essentially allowed me to leverage what Dan Sullivan would call who, not how. So this is certainly not to say that this is a hands-off pass investment for me by any means, but when I did the calculation to the best I can, right, this is all subjective, this isn't really something you can do actually in a spreadsheet, but when I was considering the amount of time I was likely to invest, my potential for upside, my assessment of the downsides, right, if things go very poorly, which you also need to consider. So even allowing for that margin of error for both my time investment and financially, it felt like this is a better way for me to support my long-term wealth building while allowing me the satisfaction and joy of growth and learning and continuing to accrue a capital stack that hopefully makes me more effective in all the things I do as a business person, as a coach, as a business owner, as a human.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, my friend. I mean, while I know some of that, I think it'll be really useful for our listeners to hear that part of the reason you were able to make this decision so thoughtfully is you had enough experience investing in other things to have something
Yes.
to measure it against, right? So I think, for those listeners who have not yet done a ton of investing outside of maybe a 401k or something, one of the ways that you can get better at making these kind of decisions in your life is experimenting a little bit, right? And trying some things out. And not only doing some reading and talking to people who've done it, but starting to invest little bits of money here and there. I think, at least this is my perspective. I've seen it become easier and easier for people to get into investing their money in a variety of ways because of technology over the last decade.
Sure.
And so you don't have to be a millionaire to start investing in real estate portfolios like the ones Mark has talked about, or franchises for that matter. Right? There's lots of ways to get involved, but I can see from what you shared, Fisher, and I knew this about you already, but for our listeners, that the reasons you were able to think so thoughtfully and strategically about this investment is because you were measuring against experience you already had. Which I think is pretty magical. So in the spirit of kind of wrapping things up here, I mean, knowing that you're just at the start of this franchising journey, what lessons do you think you've learned so far that would be great takeaways for our listeners and viewers?
I mean, outside of the ones we have discussed so far, as being like painfully having to face how complex I try to make everything I touch. I think
I think also just to jump in there and say that the takeaway for listeners there in some ways is if you're going to invest time, energy, and money in some investment, then you might consider having it be an investment that helps you build a skill set that you will find useful in your career. That's what you've done here. That's the big picture, which is you saw that you could really learn to get better at simplifying processes. Franchises offer you an opportunity to do that. And so it made that a more appealing investment, but it's because you were clear about some ways you want to grow as an entrepreneur. And so I think that could be a great takeaway for folks, is that what are the ways you want to grow as an entrepreneur, and can your next investment help in that development process? Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. Continue.
Yeah. No, I think that's true, and I think that another potential takeaway for listeners, which is not necessarily something that was new to me per se, but just thinking about your long-term investment strategies, and that is something that a lot of training gym owners, particularly if you're not doing well enough to get by, if you're just getting by day to day, I understand you might not have the cash to really think about that. That might not be a happy thought, but certainly the unicorn side, something we just like hammer, because we've got some sophisticated people in there. There are people in there making, by all accounts, like really, they're doing very, very well for themselves. I like to think we've contributed. We can't take all the credit. A lot of these people, are pretty sophisticated people that we're going to do pretty well no matter what happened. But one of the things that is enjoyable about the group at this point is, for instance, there's even a Unicorn University course, which is really just about investing, right? So members in our community have the opportunity to really think holistically about this, because how one chooses to invest, you do have to weigh a lot of factors, right? And there's an argument to be made for things that allow for maybe more upside, but are going to require more, elbow grease on your part, versus things that are by definitionally a little more passive, because you're not in a position that realistically you can squirrel away that much time away from your business without it having negative impact. And ultimately, you're the person best to decide. Obviously, if we ever have a chat, I'm happy to help you kind of unpack all of this, because I do think that needs to be considered, because I think if you do something that is going to be more labor intensive and requires you going deep and, just like crypto or NFTs, and you start spending tons of time doing that for potential upside, but your cash flow instrument starts to go south, like that's not super cool. On the other hand, if you've gotten to a place where you are taking care of your bases, right? And again, it's beyond the scope of this particular podcast, but you've got X amount in your savings account, you've got an emergency fund, and you have like a midterm savings, and you've started really taking advantage of pre-tax retirement instruments. At this point, then it's worth at least considering, is there some way to leverage some of the skills you developed as an entrepreneur to look at opportunities, vehicles that potentially will lead to a potentially higher compounding return over time?
Yeah. Well, I think if I was to try and summarize some of that, tell me if this is a fair summary, is that many entrepreneurs that we work with, at least to start, are focused on their income. focused on generating more income for themselves, which is the right thing to focus on at first.
Totally.
And at some point, you get enough personal income as an entrepreneur, and you're putting enough away for retirement and savings and all the things Mark just mentioned, that it's time to at least start turning your attention to wealth building. And wealth building, long-term wealth building, is a different skill set, because it's not about your income very much anymore, right? It's about how you leverage that income to make even more money. And like Fisher said, our Unicorn University folks have a whole course that helps introduce that idea and help them think through it. But I think for our dear listeners, if that sounds appealing to you, go start reading. There's a ton of online courses, a ton of books. I mean, any resources you could recommend, Fisher, that really helped you wrap your arms around investing?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, I always suggest people just keep it simple, because I think if anything, the most common mistake I see is people get too sexy when they should just be doing the basics, which I would argue is the problem in literally any field of human achievement. So I would recommend people maybe read David Bach's Automatic Millionaire and Ramit Sethi's I Will Teach You to Be Rich, which is a horribly tacky name, but great book. So I think if you read those two books, you'll have a good sense of the basics of what to do. And I would encourage you to focus there rather than what I see sometimes, which is people trying to shoot for the moon and going for these crypto NFT. And I have all sorts of thoughts. Maybe we can do another podcast. I have a lot
Chasing
of
the
thoughts about
trends.
that.
If you're going to start, right,
class.
start somewhere that's not chasing the trend. Start somewhere that's kind of
do the basics, right? Make sure you get the basics first. I think that's the most important thing, and then you can start looking into these other things. But to your point, Keeler, I think the thing that is important for people to understand is if you're really looking to set yourself up and your family, it's not going to be an income game alone. So if you have, and again, this is a good problem to have, but if you have, massive amounts of money sitting in your business bank account because you're afraid that a pandemic's going to happen again, or you run into some issues, that's maybe not ideal. And I think, certainly with inflation being what it is, hopefully you're not doing the same hoarding a bunch of cash, because that's literally losing value every single day. So, and I know this kind of stuff, maybe as a final comment here, can feel very overwhelming and intimidating, but just think about your clients. It's kind of like fitness, and the basics are not that complicated, but when it's a whole new realm of human knowledge and you don't have any experience or understanding of it, and you run a business, so in theory, if you look at like stocks, like you're buying businesses, so in theory you have a little bit of a sense of what's going on there. I would really encourage you, just read a few books about the basics, the way you would approach any field of human knowledge. If you read, 2, 3, 5 books, after a while, the information is going to start to rhyme. And in the beginning, your focus is likely on what are the things that pretty much everybody's agreeing on. Focus on those. And then once you have that base, then yes, over time, you can look, I think, at more sophisticated kinds of investings that, probably require a little bit more rigor, probably have a little bit more potential downside, but also allow for more exponential upsides.
Great. Awesome. Well, we'll end with that, my friend. Thanks for sharing your journey so far. I'm pretty sure we can promise some follow-up podcasts to our listeners that will continue to keep you posted on, what this path looks like for Fisher. And thanks as always, my friend, for bringing some honesty and transparency, just sharing what's going on in your life. I think it's something that our listeners really enjoy. So thanks, my friend. All right, friends. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.
Well, I hope you loved today's podcast, and forgive me, I want to remind you one more time, if you haven't already done so, head over to businessofunicorns.com, click the button, and get your free self-assessment, the ultimate training gym owner report card. I promise you're going to want to dig into this resource and get the support you need, finding crystal clarity on exactly where you need to be focusing to create a life and a business you love.